that now is really, what can we learn from the pandemic? How has the pandemic impacted on practices and cultures? Now, there are two key studies that I want to refer to here. One is a national study by my colleagues, my colleague Meta Westander, who is the CEO of Disabled Students UK. Now, they conducted a national study with disabled students, looking to access their insights and experiences of inclusive provision in higher education during the pandemic. Alongside that, DS UK worked alongside myself and also colleagues at Wolverhampton University, where we conducted a pilot project. Ultimately, the feedback we had from our pilot project very much reflected the key points that came out of the national study with DS UK. And these are some of the main themes that emerged. I'm just going to walk you through them. Funding financial disparities, problems with accessibility to the environment and equipment, plus support. Administrative burden. That goes back to the point I made earlier in terms, and also raised by one of the students in my study a number of years ago, around bureaucracy and form filling and having to chase people via emails or phone calls and going to different offices to try and get a decision on a resource or whatever it might be. Well-being, inequality, social gap, sense of belonging, being othered, housing and accommodation challenges. And these are some citations from the pilot study I did, highlighting and really stemming from the voices of our disabled students, speaking about the barriers they experienced during the pandemic. Again, what have we learned? So initially, this student has noted the university would not accommodate my reasonable adjustments. This changed when I raised a complaint. However, I've since had to defer until January 22 as my Student Finance England made errors with my DSA provision. So this is looking again now in terms of policy provision around disabled students allowance. And I'll be picking up on that on the next slide. But just to note that there are some revisions taking place to that policy, and that stems from work that Lord Chris Holmes has been doing over the last year. I've been involved in that research with him, and that's looking at really how policy is failing our disabled students, how the Disability Student Allowance provision is failing those students, and what recommendations need to be taken on board for more effective provision. So I'm going to recommend a link to this work as we go through into the next slide shortly. Another example of exclusive provision here, supervisors and tutors, example of inclusive provision, supervisors and tutors being incredibly supportive, but getting relevant permissions always involve bureaucratic hassles. So again, the bureaucratic issues, the challenges in relation to who do I speak to, who do I email, which forms do I fill out, who needs to sign it, etc. How can we make that much more efficient in our provision? DS UK's research again came up with 6 lessons around taking an anticipatory approach and resourcing staff. Now, they had 326 respondents from 69 higher education providers across the UK, and the research provided some really rich data. And they found that just 23.1% of disabled students were receiving the support they needed over the pandemic, with many saying they felt left behind, alienated and forgotten. Now, that is not the kind of experience I think any of us want for any of our students once they've made a commitment to, invested in, and see themselves as being a part of a university geographical space, a university learning experience to enable them to move forward in terms of their career, which ultimately will have a positive impact in our wider society. None of us want to hear any of our students saying that they feel left behind, alienated or forgotten. So what do we need to do in order to respond to that? Now, Meta and her team within DSU came out with 6 lessons. So, and I think that these lessons very much reflect the main themes that came out of our pilot study. So where we have issues around financial disparities and inequality with regards to inaccessibility to the environment and equipment, we need to be taking an anticipatory approach. Now, a lot of this takes us right back to 2000 with the Special Educational Needs and Disability Act, in that we have got an anticipatory duty and it's enshrined in the law. So this really should have been happening already. So we need to take that on board and realise that we are not being fully anticipatory in our provision, and we are not being fully compliant really in terms of our legal requirements as a sector, I would argue. And hence we need to be listening to our students and taking on more effective provision and practice. So research by Nolan, who I mentioned earlier, and also Hector, are arguing that pandemic-induced practices have resulted in more equality for many students, whilst at the same time causing further unjust forms of provision. And we know from research that's come out recently from the Disabled Students Commission, a nice significant research report in 2022, the key themes that they're arguing for is for more effective communication, being more consistent in our provision, so that if a student goes to one class and is receiving their lecture notes in advance, they're getting the same sort of provision in another module. So it's about being consistent, it's about offering choice, and also about being certain. So when we can say to our students at an open day, yes, you will receive additional support. Yes, there is funding for this. Yes, we do have accessible teaching and learning, that we actually ensure that we are fully responsive to those messages in terms of the actual provision that the students then do receive when they come to university. I've already cited this point from Nolan earlier, but I think it speaks very loudly. To me it does, because again, it's making that connection around the intersection point, or the intersectionality point. So even if some of our students have similar disabilities, and even if they have a similar disability, that doesn't mean because one student has MS and another student has MS, that it's the same sort of provision that each of them will need. It's not. It's very much got to be weighted on an individual situation and an individual report. And then the issue here also being made that because we have, for example, as Nolan says, the individual level barriers of a white male will be different than those of a black woman, even if they have similar disabilities. So again, that point that we take on board the other aspect of their identity, really considering those various intersectional elements. So that's really the second point then. So the first one, that widening participation has failed to date in my view, and why has it failed to date? So we've looked at that. The second point, what have we learned from our students during the pandemic? And this third point we're going to cover now, what do we need to do to take those insights forward? Okay, so I would suggest that practices therefore need to begin with having conversations. We need to be having conversations with students, listening to those students and understanding what they really need, and acknowledge and acting upon that. Now that's a citation that's come out of our pilot study with DS UK. Disability student support services need to be more accessible and consistent in their communications. Now we have developed a series of quite new forms of provision and proactive forms of provision within our university student services, making sure that all of our students who disclose a disability have got mentoring provision set up straight away in advance of any disability student allowance funding coming through, because we know there is a break and a barrier in terms of time from when a student discloses a disability to actually accessing the funding once they've gone through the various rigmaroles in terms of application forms. That's all going back to Student Finance England, etc. So in terms of speeding that up and filling the gap, at the University of Plymouth, we have a mentoring system set up in advance. We've got that provision already in place before the funding comes through. Of course, not all universities have that, but we know that it's something that's come back from the DS UK work as being a good form of inclusive practice. So it's about reaching out to our students and understanding what their individual requirements would be. We've become much more equipped to deliver online. So the argument then very much is, well, let's continue to do that where we can. So if we are recording our lectures, let's continue to record our lectures. If we are providing hybrid, let's continue to provide hybrid where and when it is possible to do so. Yes, there is a lot of arguments to be made around the importance of one-to-one and the benefit of learning in that context. We also know that for some of our disabled students, the benefit of having more readily available access online has enabled them, particularly those who struggle with fatigue, to access their learning at a time more conducive to fit with their needs. It's about being compassionate, being proactive in terms of our consultation, being aware about mental health and hidden disability, this sense of community and compassion. I think there was a real significant development around compassion in terms of how we work with each other, both as colleagues and our students. And I, for one, am hoping that many of us will hang on to that and bring that, continue that in terms of the way in which we work with our face-to-face delivery as well. So empowering our disabled students, giving access to their voices, and also giving them priority in terms of when we consider other intersections as well. And as I've mentioned earlier, I think academic can also mean activist. We need to arguably reimagine what it means to be an inclusive academic today. I think between the Me Too movement, the Black Lives Matters movement, the LGBT equality movement, all of these matters are core in terms of the wider debate around a socially equal and inclusive higher education provision, including all of our students, regardless of what their identity may or may not be. So my view is that we need to be having these, what may be for some challenging conversations, because from my position, I think if we consider ourselves to be inclusive educators, we are political. To be an inclusive educator is to be a political educator, because to be an inclusive educator is someone who is pushing against the general flow. And that connects to the work of Sarah Ahmed, who talks about the fact that in her research, many of her widening participation practitioners or practitioners in higher education working for equality find themselves being very challenged daily by ways in which things are done and the way in which diversity can be positioned and repositioned in ways that continue to discriminate and oppress. So if you are an inclusive educator, you are a political educator, I would suggest. And in that case, there may well be an activist within you, if not there already. And in terms of how we work and how we co-create change within our various institutions, I think that can't be done in isolation. No person is an island. For me and my work, a lot of the significant outputs that I've had over the years have always been those outputs that have been done in collaboration. So I'm very much one that would argue if we're going to push for equality and for systemic change, we need to be working in partnership with others. We need to be utilising critical forms of pedagogy as opposed to what Paulo Freire would refer to as your traditional banking form of learning. We need to be working in collaboration. We need to be engaging with the wider public, and that links to the point I made earlier about the Office for Students, where there is an argument being made now that universities really do need to be working more effectively and readily in terms of outreach and working in their communities. And that comes into the issue around post-16 as well. And of course, we know that in that whole area, many of our young people who have special education needs disability are being failed within our mainstream secondary system. And that then results in a failure for us to enable those young people to effectively progress on to higher education and to move on forward in terms of their achievement and their progression. So we need to be having those conversations, I would suggest, with the wider public within our university campuses and environment. And that links in then to practices around knowledge exchange, where we actually get our students working alongside us in various projects within our wider community.